as the club's liveried footman approached to refill his glass. "You're the one to blame for the quietude, then. Give us a damned scandal, Haybury." Oliver inclined his head. "I shall do my best, or worst, rather." Diane Benchley, Lady Cameron, in London, and he supposed they'd run across each other at some soiree or other now. After all, Mayfair was a small place, smaller even than Vienna. He downed the remainder of his glass of whiskey and poured himself another. Mention of her name might have caught him unawares tonight, but when he saw her face to face, he wouldn't be the one flinching, not a muscle, not any muscle, and she'd best keep her pretty mouth shut as well, or he would be forced to do something unpleasant. "Are you wagering, Haybury?" Mandelin asked, "or are you taking up embroidery?" Gathering his less-than-pleasant thoughts back in for later private contemplation, Oliver glanced at the rack of spent cards and put £2 on the knave. In his experience, the knave always won. "Diane, you have a caller." Diane Benchley, Lady Cameron, looked up from the spread of papers on what had been her late husband's desk. "I'm not seeing anyone," she muttered, and returned to sifting through the figures and decimals and subtractions every sheet seemed to feature, no exceptions. "I know that, my dear," her companion returned, not moving from her position in the office doorway. "It's Lord Cameron." For a heartbeat, ice ran up Diane's spine. In that swift moment, every hand she'd shaken, every breath of wind on the passage from the continent, every thunderclap to her chest since she'd left Vienna, caught in her throat. It had all been for nothing if... Swearing beneath her breath, she shook herself. Frederick Benchley had died 2 years ago. She'd been by his bedside when he'd drawn his last breath. She'd stood at his graveside when the pair of workmen had shovelled dirt into the hole where they'd placed his cheap pine coffin. "For God's sake, Jenny, don't do that," she stated aloud, setting her pencil aside and rubbing at her temple with still shaking fingers. Alarm crossed her companion's face, and Genevieve Martin hurried deeper into the room. "Oh, good heavens, you know I meant the new Earl, of course. I never thought—" "Don't trouble yourself, Jenny. You did startle me nearly out of my skin, however. Where is Anthony Benchley?" "In the morning room. He asked for you, and then for tea." Diane pushed away from the desk and stood. "Well, at least we may assume that word of my arrival in London has travelled swiftly. That's something, I suppose." "Yes, we may count one fortunate thing since our return here, then." Jenny blew out her breath. "And 24 unfortunate things. To which column do I add Lord Cameron?" "The unfortunate one. Come with me if you would. I want to be rid of him as swiftly as possible." "What do you think he wants?" Genevieve asked, in the light French accent that seemed to fade or intensify according to her mood. "Money, of course. That's what all the men of the Benchley family want, and as far as I've been able to determine, none of them are capable of keeping their hands on any of it they touch." She frowned. "And Adam House, most likely. He can't have that, either." "Perhaps he only wishes to reminisce," Jenny suggested dubiously. "You were married to his brother, after all." "There is very little about my life as part of that family that I care to remember," Diane retorted, lowering her voice as they reached the foot of the stairs. She'd known that eventually she would have to speak with a Benchley, but for heaven's sake, she'd been in London for less than 2 days. In that time, Jenny might have compiled a list of 24 unfortunate things, but it had merely taken one disaster to set Diane's entire plan on its ear. In fact, the only happenstance she could imagine that would make things worse would be if it were Oliver Warren, the Marquis of Haybury, waiting for her in her morning room. Anthony Benchley was an annoyance, nothing more. That thought actually steadied her as she stepped into the room. Her former brother-in-law stood looking out the front window, his dark hair and ruddy complexion, and even the way he tapped his fingers against his thigh, reminded her forcibly of his older brother, and she didn't like that, not at all. "Lord Cameron," she said aloud. He started, then turned to look at her. "Diane," he returned, and walked forward.